Direction Point! Direction Point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome back to Doctor Who Literature, the podcast taking you through the world of the Doctor Who novelizations put out by Target Books from 1973 onward in publication order. My name is Jason, and I'm your host on this journey, this very long journey. We're a member of the Direction Point Doctor Who podcast network. And incidentally, a happy Doctor Who Day to all of you at home. This is my first episode released after November 23rd, 2023, Doctor Who's 60th anniversary, and it is the first episode released mere hours after the premiere of The Star Beast, the first episode of the RTD2 era, which sees the return of David Tennant and Catherine Tate, and so much more besides. This episode is the last episode in a row of my November 2023 4-week detour into Doctor Who's 60th anniversary. I do have 2 other interviews recorded this month, which I will air at a later date, likely as bonus episodes in between seasons. I know that all of you are very interested in hearing me get back to the Target books, and that will resume next week with The Mind of Evil, book 96. But today, I want to celebrate the entire run of Doctor Who by bringing you all the way from the creation of the show and the production of An Unearthly Child up through The Star Beast. To that end, the main part of today's episode is my interview with Paul Hayes, the author of Pull to Open from 10 Acre Films books. I am very, very excited to bring you this interview with Paul. Reading the book was an absolute delight, a pleasure, something new or unique learned on every page. Paul was very generous with his time, and we have a very deep interview about the making of his book and some of the, but not by any means all, of the great stories you can find within its pages. I will include a link to the book in the show notes, but in the meantime, please enjoy my interview with Paul. After that, we welcome back to the show 2 longtime friends of the program for discussions about The Star Beast. We're going to have a brief review from Jim Sangster and an interview with Jan Fennick, who's been on this show before and many episodes of Trap One, as well as a fixture on my panels at LI Who, and of course I am also a fixture on her panels. So with my 3 guests today, we are going to cover everything from 1963 to 2023. Let's get to it.
A Whovian and a Nuvian walk into a TARDIS.
And explore every episode of the classic Doctor Who series.
Join me, podcaster John S. Drew,
And me, writer-editor Jim Beard, as we take apart each story starting from the very beginning in 1963.
and join us on our Facebook page and Twitter, where we continue the discussion with you with historical artifacts from British papers of the time. The Doctor's Beard podcast, released every Saturday around tea time on your favorite podcasting app.
And we'll see you in time and space. You're listening to Doctor Who Literature. Keep turning the pages.
As Doctor Who Literature continues on with its exploration of Doctor Who's 60th anniversary, I'm happy to announce that I've just finished the new book from 10 Acre Films, Pull to Open, by Paul Hayes. And joining me this week to discuss that book is the author himself, Paul Hayes. Welcome to Doctor Who Literature.
Jason, thank you very much for having me. It's a very great honour to be invited on, and very flattered that you've asked me to come on and talk about the book.
I was taking a look at your website before the recording, and I noticed that you have a piece coming out in Radio Times related to Doctor Who's actual 60th.
Yes, Radio Times magazine. They very kindly asked me to do a piece for the new edition, which came out on Tuesday and covers the week starting today. We're talking Saturday the 18th. It's they're not doing their Doctor Who anniversary special edition till next week, even though that's after the anniversary, because their listings start on a Saturday and the episode's going out on Saturday the 25th. They're saving their sort of main anniversary issue for the next week. But obviously they wanted something in the issue that does actually cover the anniversary date, Thursday the 23rd. And I was lucky enough a couple of months ago to write a piece for them for their 100th anniversary edition. And they asked me if I would write something for them for this week, for the week covering the Doctor Who anniversary, about the link there's always been between Doctor Who and Radio Times. I think a lot of Doctor Who fans know, but for any Doctor Who fans who don't know, from countries outside the UK, Radio Times was a magazine set up by the BBC in the 1920s so they could publish their own listings. And it was owned by the BBC for 80-odd years till they sold it in 2011. But it was a really important part of the BBC for decades and decades, for a couple of reasons, really, because it was the only place you could get a full week's BBC listings. Newspapers were only allowed to publish each day individually. So it had a sort of captive audience. It used to, at its peak, it sold millions of copies a week. And so it was a really important publicity and promotional tool for the BBC, as we might end up touching on a bit later, because this comes into the Doctor Who story. But also, it was also important for the BBC because it was the only place in the UK where the BBC could sell advertising. Obviously, they couldn't sell advertising on the air, on radio or television, but there was no law against them selling advertising in the pages of the Radio Times. So it was a good money-making operation for the BBC as well, because the Radio Times wasn't part of the service that all viewers and listeners were entitled to from the licence fee that we pay in the UK. It was an extra. You just bought the magazine if you wanted it, so the BBC could still advertise. So it's really sort of big part of the culture in the UK for many years, and a really important part of the BBC's history. And it has had a close relationship with Doctor Who since Doctor Who started. So it was nice as a Doctor Who fan to be able to write a little bit about that in the latest issue.
And since we're talking about Radio Times for the moment, I'm going to jump up a question from further on down my list. We think of Doctor Who today as a cultural monolith, a multi-million-dollar property with some very, very big production companies currently on board with the making and distribution of the show. It stands to reason that when Doctor Who premiered 60 years ago, it would have been pride of place with a photo on the front cover of Radio Times. Is that correct?
Well, that certainly seems to have been the plan initially. I mean, right from the very early days in the summer of 1963, before the show had even gone into production, in July, towards the end of July, there was one of the co-creators of Doctor Who, Donald Wilson, who was an executive in the BBC drama department. He hosted what was called a preliminary promotion meeting in his office, and the production team were there, Verity Lambert and I think David Whittaker, and some of the BBC's promotional people, and some of the, I don't know who went, a representative from the Radio Times went. The list just says Radio Times representative, I think, so I'm not sure who went from the magazine, but they were there. And so Radio Times were kind of involved and being briefed about this programme from the start, because even though Radio Times in those days was owned and operated by the BBC, it was sort of editorially independent. The programme makers couldn't just say to them, oh, you're going to feature this, you're going to put this on the cover, you're going to do features about this. It was a BBC thing, but the staff there were kind of editorially independent. So they couldn't just be told what to do, but they were brought on board. And actually, the first time that the four regular cast members of Doctor Who ever met all together as a foursome was in the September, when a photo session took place in the basement photo studio at BBC Television Centre, the BBC's TV headquarters in London. And there was a BBC photographer there, Douglas Plale, and also a Radio Times photographer, Don Smith. And the Radio Times took various pictures. I'm sure many people are familiar with them, that first set of promotional pictures. They had a sort of classroom set and a kind of a junkyard set, and they took various pictures of the four of them. And yeah, the plan seems to have been that Doctor Who would get the cover for the week starting Saturday the 23rd of November. The issue would have gone on sale a couple of days before that. But then early in November, at the beginning of November, Donald Wilson hears that the Radio Times have got cold feet about this, and they've decided not to give it the cover. And the reason it seems that they decided against this was because they thought there was a lack of confidence in the programme at senior levels of the BBC, the sort of controller of programmes level. And Donald Wilson writes this, I think, quite well-known memo that a lot of people have seen down the years to the editor of the Radio Times, are saying that there is no lack of confidence in the programme. I mean, that wasn't strictly true. I mean, the chief of programmes for BBC One, Donald Baverstock, had already tried to knock it on the head after 4 episodes.
Yes.
So Donald Wilson, I think, is being a bit economical with the actuality there. But he then, of course, says this famous quote, which I think is very well known by a lot of people, where he writes in this memo one of the most prophetic things which is written in all of Doctor Who's prehistory. I myself believe that we have an absolute knockout in this show, and that there will be no question but that it will run and run. Oh yes, we got it on it's the pull-out quote on the back cover of the book. Yes, and,
Yes.
I've always loved that quote. I've always, ever since I probably first read it in the David J. Howe, Mark Stamson, Stephen James Walker book, the First Doctor Handbook, because that has a lot of this production documentation in it. When I was a teenager, and I've always loved that kind of sense of foreshadowing that quote has. I mean, Newman says similar things as well in other memos. One memo from very early on where he says we will have an outstanding winner. But just something about that Donald Wilson quote, I just read the idea it will run and run. Yes, it did run and run. Sadly, his faith in it didn't sway Douglas Williams, the editor of the Radio Times at the time. And I mean, to be fair to the Radio Times, they were kind of right. There had been a lack of confidence at some senior levels in the BBC about this show, and they did give it quite a hefty amount of coverage. In the previous week's issue at the end, they had a little preview thing saying, kind of watch out for this next week. In the issue itself, covering the 23rd, it does get in the end, the cover went to a very well-known comedian at the time called Kenneth Horne. The new season of his radio show was starting that week, and they gave him the cover. This was in the days when, we were coming towards the end of the days when big radio shows could kind of get covers instead of TV shows, but it was still happening at that point. So they gave Kenneth Horne the cover, but they gave Doctor Who a mention on the cover. It does get one of the sort of strap lines on the cover, and there's this sort of big coverage of it inside. There's an article and pictures and things, so it's not as if the Radio Times completely ignored it. And as I say, Kenneth Horne was a really well-known, very popular comedian at the time, so it wasn't as if he was a kind of outrageous choice to go on the cover that week. It wasn't as if it was a ridiculous decision to put him on the cover. But obviously retrospectively, it does seem a shame. And of course, again, I think quite well known that 10 years ago, the Radio Times, as a kind of apology, they did a mock-up of what that cover might have looked like if it had William Hartnell on the front. But I think they've made up for it a lot since they've had. Now Doctor Who has the record for the programme with the most Radio Times covers of any programme in the history of the magazine. The magazine's been going for 100 years now, and Doctor Who has the most covers. So I think that relationship has been repaired subsequently, but and it did give Donald Wilson the opportunity to write that lovely quote in that memo, which I think was really nice.
To turn the focus back to you for a moment, my understanding is that you also have worn many hats at BBC Radio.
Well, yes. I've been lucky enough to work for the BBC for nearly 16 years now in my day job, and I think one of the reasons why I really wanted to work for the BBC is because I always grew up with this great affection for it and love it. That's not unusual for a lot of British people, but I think one of the things you find, isn't there, about being a Doctor Who fan? There's something about the show, because I think partly because there is so much information available about how it was made and the history of it and so forth, and you can get a real insight to the behind the scenes, and quite often with a lot of people that gives you a wider interest in broadcasting and broadcasting history and those different aspects. And I was always, ever since I was very young, really very interested in the history of the BBC and how it worked, and so I was very lucky to be able to get the chance to start working there in radio. And yes, I've been fortunate to do lots of bits and pieces in radio, mostly on local radio. The BBC has national radio stations and local radio stations, and I work, and my main job is working for a radio station in the east of England, based in a city called Norwich, a station called BBC Radio Norfolk. But one of the nice things about being part of an organisation like the BBC is that once you're in it, it's possible to do bits and pieces for other branches of it. So I've been able to write bits and pieces for the online service, and I've been able to do bits and pieces that have gone out on some of the national stations. And I know the BBC as always seems to lurch from crisis to disaster, one after the other. But I'm still one of those people who's very proud of being able to say I work for the BBC, and I think a lot of that is because it is the organisation that gave us Doctor Who. So I've always had that kind of affection for it.
I've mentioned on this show before that my own Doctor Who fandom origin story also dates back to November 23rd. There's a website called Broad DWcast.
Oh, yes, that's a great website. John Preddle's website, yes.
And thanks to that, I was able to track down, by a process of working backwards from a calendar, the very first night that I watched Doctor Who as an 11-year-old. November the 23rd, 1984, is when my PBS station in New York aired Time Flight Part 1 for the first time. Now, it's a massive coincidence that would be impossible to duplicate, just happening to watch the show on the anniversary you didn't know it was having. But what's your own Doctor Who fandom origin story?
It is great, isn't it, how we can use Doctor Who to kind of plot those points of our lives? Because, again, as I said, because it's such a well-documented show, you can, for what for other people would be just kind of vague childhood memories they couldn't really place, we have this wonderful opportunity. We can quite often nail them down exactly to when and where they happened. Doctor Who, like a lot of people in Britain, Doctor Who's kind of just always been there. It is part of the culture. You can't really say when you first heard of it any more than you could say when you first heard of the weather forecast or the news. It's just something that's kind of always been there. I certainly remember when I was very, very small. I was born in 1984, actually. And I remember watching the show with my family in the late 80s when I was a small child through the McCoy era. Oddly, it's the only programme I can remember all of us watching together. So my mother, father, my brother, sister and I. My brother and sister are quite a bit older than me. My sister's 6 years older and my brother's 9 years older. So there weren't sort of many shows that would kind of, draw all our interest. And I'm sure there probably were other shows that all of us watched. But I guess because Doctor Who's the one that I love so much, and it's the only one I recall, it's the only one I remember, all five of us all watching. And I've got lots of memories of being 4 and 5 and watching the McCoy. So it was always a show that I really loved. I can't really pin down, there's not kind of a moment where I became a fan, but I just always really loved it and it really grabbed me. And like a lot of people, I think I saw it in a kind of haphazard manner. So I saw those McCoy stories later on as a very small child. And then in the early 1990s, BBC Two, the BBC has sort of two main television networks in the UK. BBC One, which is the kind of big mainstream one, and BBC Two, which was designed to sort of cater for sort of more minority kind of interests and more niche programming. And they would quite often run repeats of archive programming. And in the early 90s, they repeated quite a few Doctor Who serials. And it was so exciting. I think one of the things that really drew me in as a fan that I really loved was that I knew it had this history to it, and it seemed kind of mythic because I only ever got little glimpses of it here and there, and so it seemed like this big, mysterious, tantalizing thing that I only ever saw little bits and pieces of here and there, and that made it kind of all the more enticing and all the more interesting. So I was definitely a very dedicated fan from very early on, and yes, I've just always loved it, and it's always been a very dear thing to me, and one of the things that means most to me in my life, if that doesn't sound like a kind of overblown thing to say about a silly TV science fiction show.
As I do a weekly podcast on the subject for the last 2 years, I certainly agree with you. This little show has had an outsized influence on me personally. I've been asking all my guests over the last few months, what is your favorite Doctor Who TV story of all time? As you are literally my 60th anniversary guest for the actual anniversary, let me pose the same question to you. What is your favorite Doctor Who TV story ever?
Well, it's always a difficult question, isn't it? Because there's always so many that you just think are really good or you have a particularly nostalgic affection for. And it is a tricky one, but I do think the one that probably means the most to me, the one I can go back to again and again and always enjoy and just really love is Remembrance of the Daleks from 1988 for all kinds of reasons. It's partly a nostalgic thing. I mean, with those McCoy stories, I can watch any of them and enjoy them kind of nostalgically, but I can also, tell which ones are really good and which ones maybe aren't so good and I enjoy for different reasons. But the Remembrance of the Daleks, I remember watching it. I've got this very clear memory and I must have known what Daleks were. I know I knew what Daleks were because I had probably used to belong to my brother, who I mentioned is 9 years older than me. I think it was the 1978 Dalek Annual. So I had that as a very small child. And I've got this very clear memory of sitting on the floor in the living room in front of the television with everyone else sort of sitting on the chairs around before part one of Remembrance of the Daleks started when it would have been October 88. And I was only, 4.5 years old, but I remember having this Dalek Annual on the floor in front of me as I sat. So I must have known it was going to be a Dalek story. Obviously, it would have been billed in the Radio Times or what have you. Yes, I've got memories of watching it. And it was also, a couple of years later, probably the first kind of proper book I ever read as well. There was a local bookstore in the nearby town, Worthing, called Volume 1. And my dad used to go in there to buy books. And I can remember, again, as a very small child, this must have been about 1991. I think the book came out in 90, didn't I think? And it was on the shelves there as a new book. And I remember my dad saying to me, "Oh, would you like a book? I'll buy you a book while we're in here." And I remember the cover. I remembered seeing it on TV, so the cover was very familiar. So it took me back. So I remember seeing this one, and I picked that one. And I can remember my dad. I remember we got back home. And my dad saying to my mum, he was kind of really impressed. He was saying, he said something to my mum. Like, the quote was probably mangled itself in my memory down the years, but I can remember him saying to my mum, "It's a proper book with no pictures in it or anything." And so yeah, that was definitely. And again, the novelization, I absolutely adore that novelization as well. Just that kind of layers to it, and the world building and the characterization. And when you're young, it feels like a very kind of grown up book to read as well. And just obviously Aronovich is now hugely successful as a novelist, so we all know what a great writer he is. So there's that to it. The fact I really love the novelization as well, and just the whole, because again, I suppose I have this interest in and this pull towards the kind of creation story of Doctor Who. The fact it's set in 1963, I find that time period really kind of fascinating. So all of those and it's got the Daleks in it, and the Daleks are always brilliant. So all of those different elements to it, I think, because I think it's a great story, it's so well written, it moves at such a pace, and I've got all that those kind of nostalgic elements to it as well. It's a very long-winded and rambling way of saying Remembrance of the Daleks is my favourite Doctor Who story.
And we never know where life is going to take us. I'm sure you had no way of guessing in 1990, as you acquired that book as a young child, that you and the story's commissioning script editor, Andrew Cartmel, were going to share a publisher, 10 Acres Films, down the road.
Yeah, no, I knew that they'd obviously they did that edition of Andrew's book, but it's funny that, isn't it? It's funny how it's unbelievable that getting the chance to actually meet and speak to some of these people. I've been very, very lucky to speak to a few people down the years who've been involved with Doctor Who. I was very fortunate once. I've written a few pieces down the years for Doctor Who magazine, and quite early on, really, when I'd only really done a handful of pieces for them, I think just because I happened to have written for them recently at that point, I got an invite back in 2016 they had a 500th issue party in London. And I went to that, and there were all kinds of people there. Stephen Moffat and Mark Gatiss were there, Sophie Aldred, Daphne Ashbrook, all kinds of people. And it's because you don't, obviously, it wasn't like a convention, it wasn't like a fan event where they were expected to be bothered by random weirdos like me. So I didn't want to kind of bother these people, but I do remember just there was this point where Sophie Aldred was just kind of going by, because it was quite a crowded event, and she was just trying to get by and to get to somewhere else, and she was just passing slowly. I just said to her, "Oh, can I just say, I really loved your time in Doctor Who. It really meant a lot to me. It was on when I was a young child." And she's, I can't remember what she said now. "Oh, that's very sweet. Thank you." So it was, and I remember I shook Stephen Moffat's hand and said, "Oh, thank you very much. You don't know me, but thank you very much for the great episodes of Doctor Who." And I got to have a chat with Mark Gatiss about the origins of Doctor Who, and I think I chatted to him about Donald Wilson and we talked a bit about Adventure in Space and Time. And I'd been a few years before that, again, another event I was lucky enough to go to. I'd been at the premiere of An Adventure in Space and Time at the British Film Institute. I said to Mark Gatiss about how I'd been fortunate to be there and what a kind of emotional evening it had been. And I said, I think I was crying at the end. And he said, "Well, how do you think I felt?" So that was quite nice. I think he probably thought I was a complete lunatic, though, because some sort of nervous reaction. I ended up, through the course of our conversation, shaking his hand 3 times. And I thought after, he must have just thought I was just a complete nutter.
I have some questions about Adventure in Space and Time, which does somewhat overlap with Pull to Open. So let me bump those questions up in the running order also. Adventure in Space and Time has this phenomenal all-star cast, even down to the tertiary roles. So one of the starring roles is Brian Cox, who would have been in his mid-60s at the time, playing Sidney Newman. And Mark Eden has a small role as Donald Baverstock, Mark Eden being in his early 80s. Now, I know the broad origins of Doctor Who's foundation story, and I knew that Verity Lambert and Waris Hussein were young radicals in their late 20s. I didn't really have much of an idea about the age of the behind-the-scenes men in suits. So I had this mental image of Sidney Newman being in his mid-60s and Donald Baverstock being 82 years old, like Mark Eden. Reading your book, it was quite a surprise that is not how old those men were in reality.
Mark Eden is only about, I think, something like 5 years younger than Donald Baverstock in actual real life. He could have got away with playing Donald Baverstock in 1963. So it was slightly unfair. Yeah, he was about because Baverstock, I can't remember exactly when Baverstock was born, but he was born sometime in the mid-20s, I think about 1925, something like that. Mark Eden was playing a character about 50 years younger than he was at the time, which was slightly I know why they did it, obviously, because it's nice to have Mark Eden in it and all that kind of thing. The Newman thing I don't think is as outrageous, because I think there is that thing, isn't there, which I think does hold true to a degree, that people used to look older for whatever reason it is, whether it was diet or upbringing or healthcare or whatever. I think standards have changed as much that I don't. If you look at a picture of Newman from the early 60s and you look at Brian Cox in Adventure in Space and Time, I don't think, Sir Newman would have been, 46 at the time. So even though there is that difference, I don't think that's such an outrageous kind of one. I'm not qualified to speak on whether his Canadian accent was any good. I've read one account that said Brian Cox, for some reason, plays him as a New Yorker, which I don't know. You're probably more qualified to talk about than me, but I don't know. I don't think, from what I can remember, some Canadians saying that his accent was kind of universally kind of praised, really. But Adventure in Space. I love an Adventure in Space. As I say, I was lucky enough to be able to be at the premiere at the British Film Institute, and obviously, it's not supposed to be a documentary. It's supposed to be a dramatisation. And with any of these things, you can't do it exactly as it was, because a lot of it, especially in this case, would be people sitting in rooms having conversations and writing down notes, which doesn't make for terrifically good television drama. So it's a compression and a condensing of the story and a streamlining of it, but it gives the impression of what happened. And if that interests people and makes people want to find out more about what actually happened, I think that's all to the good. It's the drama is heightened. Baverstock tries to cancel them after 4, and you get the impression that he's cancelling them after 4 episodes while it's on air. He did suggest that they should stop after 4, but that was earlier on, while they were still in early production. But actually, by the point the show got to air, they were guaranteed a 6-month run. Initially, they'd been given 13 after Baverstock had been talked back from cancelling after 4. And then the day before it started, he went up to 26. So they already had a 6-month run guaranteed. But I think it's good fun. I feel slightly sad about some things. I'm sad Donald Wilson isn't in it at all, because I do think he does get overlooked, and he's the co-creator of the program, and I think his role is often overlooked, which I think is sad. But there are so many elements to the creation of Doctor Who that you couldn't possibly have covered all of them in a drama like that. So what Mark, as if I know him, as if he's a mate of mine or something, what Mark Gatiss did was the obvious thing you have to do in any kind of, and probably any biopic or any drama based on real events does this. You pick kind of 1 or 2 elements, and what he thought, and what probably was the kind of most striking and engaging element, was that kind of relationship between Newman, Lambert, Hussein, and them as the kind of main trio. Because I think that is quite surprising for audiences, because I think that you would expect BBC in 1963 to be a lot of kind of stuffy Englishmen, and so for it to concentrate on this Canadian, this young woman and this young Indian, I think it does make it an interesting and engaging drama.
And also, out of necessity, they compressed the roles of David Whittaker and Mervyn Pinfield into a single role.
Yeah.
David Whittaker, we are learning a lot more about now. You're, again, a fellow of yours at 10 Acres Films. Simon Gurrier's book on David Whittaker has just come out. My copy is hopefully winging its way across the Atlantic so I can read it soon. I saw Simon speak at Gallifrey One in Los Angeles earlier this year, 2023. I was astounded to learn that David Whittaker himself was only in his 30s when script editing the show, because the surviving photos make him look a lot older than mid-30s.
Well, it's another one, like we were saying, wasn't it? That I've only just started reading Simon's book. I picked my copy up from the post office the other day, but I get the impression, that Whittaker was not always particularly well, man. And again, it's that thing we're saying that I know it's a kind of cliche, but I think people quite often, not always, not universally, did look older because of those things, because things like healthcare and diet and things didn't used to be as good as they are now. That's a bit of a sweeping statement generally, but I think it does hold true in a lot of cases.
Now, the Gatiss docudrama is called An Adventure in Space and Time, and when this comes out about 10 years ago, I didn't realize there was any special significance to that title. having read your book, I see now there was a special significance. Why did he choose that particular tagline?
Yeah, well, it goes back again to the Radio Times, and even though, as I mentioned, it was part of the BBC but editorially independent, the BBC programme makers could still, and the other staff at the BBC could still, kind of make suggestions and point things out and so forth. And there's a woman who plays quite a big role in the story of Doctor Who's creation, a woman called Joanna Spicer. And she was the sort of head of administration in the BBC. She was the senior administrative person. I think her actual job title was assistant controller (brackets planning close brackets). So she was the sort of main admin person, really. And for some reason, I'm not sure why exactly it would have concerned her, but for some reason, the sort of proposed billing for how Doctor Who would be billed in the Radio Times listings came across her desk at some point, and she wrote this note which survives in the files, where she points out that it could quite easily be another Dr. Kildare from this. So she felt it needed a subtitle to point out, that it was basically a kind of space adventure show. And so the Radio Times, for the first few years, I can't remember exactly how long they used this, certainly a couple of years, I think, but don't quote me on that, but certainly for a large chunk of the 60s, they had this sort of subtitles. There would be Doctor Who, An Adventure in Space and Time was kind of a subtitle under that, so that people knew that it wasn't a medical show, basically.
Apropos of nothing, the top 4 emails in my inbox right now, 2 of them are yours for the scheduling of this recording, and the topic is Doctor Who podcast invite. The next 2 emails on top of that are from my local Brooklyn neighborhood mailing list. Doctor Who makes house calls.
Yeah.
Not about the TV program, but it's a couple of retired ladies looking for doctors to come to their homes for actual medical house calls. So, although
we
my
have
top
that thing,
4 emails
don't we?
all say Doctor Who, they're not always about Doctor Who the show.
We have that thing as fans where because that's formation, I'm sure probably in the States as well as here, does crop up in online news stories and newspaper headlines and stuff, Doctor Who assaulted patients arrested, and people always share them on social media going, oh no, he's really let himself down. And it catches our eye with that formation, doesn't it?
There's a statue of a 19th century physician directly across the street from the American Museum of Natural History on Manhattan's Upper West Side. And the person who is the subject of that statue came under controversy some years back. And there was, I believe, a New York Times headline, Doctor Who sterilized women. I'm like, wait a minute, Doctor? Very unfortunate juxtaposition of words.
Yeah, they always say it's something that often, as I say, crops up more often than you think, or we just notice it more often, don't we? Because we're Doctor Who fans. But Joanna Spicer was clearly worried that, obviously, because this was a brand new show, and they wanted people to understand what it was and what it was about. And there's that on this in this memo where she's got the draft billing of the Radio Times. She writes on it. It could quite easily be another Dr. Kildare from this.
So I was telling you before we started recording, there was basically a new revelation for me on almost every page of your book. I obviously know the broad outlines of the creation of Doctor Who. I had Doctor Who the early years in the 1980s. I've seen the Mark Gatiss docudrama. I've read a lot of, for example, Graham Burke's Sidney Newman. The Sidney Newman autobiography with Graham's biographical note at the back. So I know the broad outlines, but there were some things in this book, and this is a tribute to your research, that I was not expecting to learn. Growing up in America, as I did, the 1980s was the first decade which I was alive for every single day of. There's 2 movies, 2 rather famous American comedies that bookend the 1980s. 1980 comes out Airplane, the Abraham Zucker comedy. And in 1989 is this comedy called Weekend at Bernie's, directed by Ted Kotcheff, a Canadian American director. I was not expecting both of those movies to show up so prominently in Doctor Who's origin story, but you have connections to both of those movies in your book. How did that come to be?
Yeah, well, Airplane, of course, it shares a common ancestor with Doctor Who, a Canadian television play from 1956, without which, if that had never happened, we wouldn't have Airplane, and we probably wouldn't have Doctor Who either. It's probably one of the most famous Canadian television dramas there's ever been, although perhaps obviously it's faded in the memory a bit now, but it was very well known at the time. It was called Flight into Danger, written by an English writer who'd emigrated to Canada called Arthur Haley. and it's the story of a former fighter pilot who is on a passenger flight across Canada, going to a Canadian football game, a Grey Cup game, from Toronto to Vancouver. And during the flight, there's a meal served. You have the choice of fish or lamb. And everyone who had the fish goes down with debilitating, life-threatening food poisoning, including both of the pilots. And even though the passenger, George Spencer, he's called, hadn't flown for 10 years and only flew Spitfires and Mustangs, single-seater planes, he's the only person on the plane who has a chance of taking over and landing it. And so he's, with help from an experienced pilot talking him down on the ground, he manages to get the aeroplane down, flight into danger. And it was hugely popular. The Canadian newspapers, when it was shown in April 1956, they raved over it, and a film recording of it was made. It was a live drama, as most one-off plays, television drama at that point in the 50s was still mostly one-off plays, certainly ever in the English-speaking world. They were sort of fading a little bit in America, in the States by then, but still very popular at that point. But they did make a film recording of it, I think because at that point, the CBC in Canada, which was the only Canadian television network at the time, they couldn't easily link up the coasts, and they had obviously the time zone issue anyway. So they made a film recording of the live Toronto performance so that that could later be shown from the Vancouver station later in the month. And so we've got rave reviews in the Canadian papers. You know, this is the ultimate Canadian effort on the tiny screen, I remember one of them says. The script editor, it went out in an anthology slot called General Motors Theatre, which obviously, you know, as most TV anthologies did at the time, had a different play every week. And one of the script editors of this is called Nathan Cohen. He was in Britain over that summer, and he was, I'm not sure exactly how, but had some sort of link or connection with the BBC, and he recommended that they buy the script and do their own version. So the BBC bought the rights to do a version of the script, and the CBC sent them either as a kind of aid to show how it should be staged, or I'm not sure, or maybe a pitch when they were trying to sell them the script. They sent them a film recording of the Canadian version, and the BBC was so impressed by this that they abandoned their thoughts of doing their own version, and they showed the Canadian version of Flight into Danger. And it was a huge hit in the UK. The British newspapers really went to town on it, really used it as a stick to beat the BBC with, saying, you know, why can't we do anything as good as this? You know, the Canadians have shown us, taught us a lesson. You know, what BBC should get some technicians into Canada to see how it's done. And it was really successful. And so the BBC bought a lot more of these Canadian plays, General Motors Theatre plays, and started showing them. They couldn't call them General Motors Theatre because you can't advertise big North American cars on the BBC. So they called it Canadian Television Theatre. And every week at the end credits of these Canadian television theatre plays they were showing came up the name of the head of drama at CBC Television as a supervising producer, and it was Sidney Newman. So his name became known in the UK. He was invited to come over to the UK and spend some time here, and he was offered a job by a company called ABC. There were two television networks in Britain at the time. There was the BBC and there was ITV, which was actually much closer to being more like the kind of an American network system. Really, it was a collection of different independent stations who showed different things at certain points, but at other points they would all come together and network the same programs. So it was the ITV network, but it was made up of different regional stations, and one of them was called ABC. They covered to try and... How much detail should I give? I'll try and make this as simple as possible. To try and kind of equalise the advertising money each of these regional stations got, they had some quite odd franchise arrangements, so it kind of equalled out. So ABC had the weekend license for the English Midlands and the north of England. So that's what they did, and they had one of their main programs they put out was a Sunday night drama program called Armchair Theatre. That was another anthology show. In the 50s, kind of anthologies were one of the big kind of main types of TV drama there was. So Newman was brought over to work for ABC in 1958 as their head of drama, and also running himself personally as producer their Armchair Theatre strand. And yes, Flight into Danger had an incredible afterlife. The BBC showed it in the autumn of 56. Which American network was? I think it was NBC. They bought it. They didn't show the Canadian one, NBC, but they did their own version of the script. The following year, it was made into a feature film called 0 Hour, which, I mean, it's so bizarre. If you see Flight into Danger, and then see Zero Hour, Zero Hour already seems like the spoof. It already feels like the comedy version, just because of some of the stuff they introduce into it. And there was a German version in the 60s, an Australian version. There was another American version, a TV movie in the early 70s called Terror in the Sky. And then, of course, the film version Zero Hour was then remade as Airplane later on. And some of the lines, most of Airplane, obviously, because when they made Airplane, they hadn't seen Flight into Danger. It does exist, and I was lucky enough, even though it wasn't really directly relevant, I really wanted to see it because I'd heard so much about it on these. And so the CBC, bless them, they sold me a copy. I asked them if I could buy a copy for research, and they sold me one. And so even though most of Airplane is taken off of Zero Hour, some of the lines do survive because a lot of Zero Hour is taken from Flight into Danger, and like line about something like, you worried I'll bend your precious aeroplane or something like that. That's one of the lines that survives from Flight into Danger. And of course, the lead character in Flight into Danger, George Spencer, in Zero Hour, he's given the kind of silly name of Ted Stryker. And that's the name he carries on in Airplane. But he's George Spencer in Flight into Danger. And he is played by a well-known Canadian television face of the time who starred in many of these dramas, James Doohan, who later went on to his own science fiction career, of course, as Scotty in Star Trek. But yes, if Flight into Danger had never happened, then Newman would probably, not certainly, but probably never have come to the UK, and we would never have had Doctor Who. And yes, when he was at CBC, before he then came to Britain, one of the directors he was working with on programmes like General Motors Theatre was Ted Kotcheff. Kotcheff actually came to the UK before Newman did. A lot of Canadians came over to work in the British television industry in the 50s, Alvin Rakoff being another example. And before I started researching this book, I always thought that was a bit odd. I thought, well, the UK television industry was bigger than the Canadian television industry at that time, had more money in it. But I thought, well, why wouldn't they just, they want to go to a bigger TV industry, but why not just go to the biggest TV industry of all, which is just next door? And what I didn't realise was that actually at that point, if you were a citizen of a Commonwealth country, which obviously Canada was, at that point in history, you were regarded as being a British citizen. You had full UK citizenship rights. So you could come over, if you were a citizen of any Commonwealth country, you could come and live and work in the UK very easily and do whatever you wanted. Which, I understand it's still the case now, that actually it was very difficult for Canadians to go and work in the USA, actually, for work permit reasons and all that kind of thing, green cards and all that. So it was actually, even though it meant crossing an ocean, it was actually much easier for the Canadians to go and work in the British television industry than it was for them to go south and work in the US television industry. But yes, Ted Kotcheff, he'd actually ended up moving before Newman, and he was already working for ABC. And he was actually, when Newman came over initially in the summer of 57, just on a kind of visit, and he was chatted up by ABC at that time and eventually accepted a job with them. He came over again at Christmas 57 to finalise the terms. And while he was over here, he went to the ABC studios to watch a play being made and wondered what he'd got himself into, because that play had a technical fault and didn't go out. And it was Ted Kotcheff directing that, and he met up with Ted again, and he met Ted's girlfriend, who was a production assistant working at ABC called Verity Lambert.
And Alvin Rakoff also acquired a girlfriend/wife who also plays a large part in Doctor Who's ongoing story.
Yes, Alvin Rakoff, another of the Canadians who came over, who'd actually met Newman back in the 30s when Newman had been doing some art classes, I think, at a summer camp in Canada. And Rakoff was actually a kid who went to one of these summer camp art classes run by Newman in the 30s. And he reminded Newman of this when they met years later. But yes, Alvin Rakoff married Jacqueline Hill. And there's a story that I think this was a story Lambert told later on, that Verity Lambert became quite frustrated at being a production assistant at ABC. She wanted to become a director or a producer, and she felt kind of stuck in her role. Even though Newman really liked her, for whatever reason, we don't know, he wouldn't promote her and give her a chance as a director. And so in 1959, she decided she'd had enough of being stuck in that role, and she decided to take a chance and go and see if she could find some work in America. So she took a liner over to New York, and she didn't really have anything set up. She had some letters of introduction, but she didn't have anything kind of firmed up. And she ended up working for someone who I think was quite a well-known figure in the US television industry at the time, called David Susskind.
Oh, yes.
It was an independent producer who I think made shows for all the different networks. And she ended up working for him. And he also, during that time, he'd been in London and he'd seen a play on television directed by Alvin Rakoff. He thought Rakoff was really good, so he brought Rakoff over to do a couple of plays for him in America, in the States. Rakoff brought his wife over with him that summer of 1959. And the story that Lambert later told was that she was walking along a street in New York, thinking that she didn't like any of the hairstyles of any of the women that she could see on this street until she spotted one that she liked. And then she realised that said hairstyle was being worn by Jacqueline Hill, who she knew because Ted Kotcheff and Alvin Rakoff had both been part of this kind of Canadian mafia that was taking over British television drama. They had sort of poker nights, and there were lots of kind of social get-togethers between the kind of Canadian contingent. So that's how Lambert had come to know Jacqueline Hill. And so they bumped into each other again in New York in 1959 and obviously remained friends. And it was because of that personal friendship that later on Lambert thought Hill would be a good person to play one of the leads in Doctor Who.
It's funny you mentioned about the hairstyles. My parents, both native New Yorkers, my mother would have been a teenager when Verity Lambert was here. But, my mother also had the beehive hairstyle back in the day. And whenever she would watch black and white Doctor Who over my shoulder, she would always comment that the hairstyles were authentic to the 60s that she remembered.
Well, you clearly, Lambert, if she did ever see your mother in passing, would have approved of the hairstyle.
Now, Weekend at Bernie's I saw when it first came out in the theater. That was the summer that I was 15 going on 16. It's a rather screwball comedy about two young office workers, and their boss dies, and they have to pretend that the corpse is still alive so that they can avoid being assassinated by a hitman. I didn't realize that the notion of masking a dead body is somewhat autobiographical for Ted Kotcheff.
Oh, yes, of course, yes. So I mentioned Armchair Theatre. This was the big kind of Sunday night play on ITV, made by ABC, networked across the ITV network. Used to get huge viewing figures, really popular series. I mean, there were only two networks at the time, and the programme before it was a very, very popular entertainment show called Sunday Night at the London Palladium. I guess a bit like a kind of slightly straighter version of Saturday Night Live, maybe. So there'd be like musical acts and comedy acts and that kind of thing. And then after that, you get Armchair Theatre, and it would get huge viewing figures. And so Newman produced that. Lambert worked on it as a production assistant. Kotcheff was a director on it. And then one of these plays in the autumn of 58, I think it was, a play called Underground. It was a post-apocalyptic play set after a nuclear attack. Some survivors who'd been on the London Underground, the subway system, when this nuclear attack had happened. And so it's about how they kind of band together and survive in this kind of subterranean environment after a nuclear attack. And yes, one of the actors in it was an actor called Gareth Evans. And unfortunately, there's a kind of urban myth that he died on air. He didn't die live on air, but while he was in makeup, I think it was, between two of his scenes, he had a heart attack and collapsed and died. The actors weren't told. I don't know how aware the production team were, whether they just thought he was ill or whether they knew he died. I'm not sure. But there was a commercial break. Luckily, they were on ITV and not the BBC, so they had like a few minutes to compose themselves. And Newman was there. Newman would always, he didn't like to sort of interfere too directly with productions. He kind of used to sit in the gallery kind of early on in his TV career, but he realised he was a bit of a kind of intimidating / annoying presence for his directors. So Newman he would sit in a kind of booth to the side of the gallery so that he wasn't kind of interfering with what the director was doing. So Newman came into the gallery and he told Kotcheff, well, we just have to carry on. I think there was all various frantic phone calls to presentation and the network deciding what are we going to do, and they decided they would carry on. So he claims, I think in his memoirs, this sort of quite famous line, he told Kotcheff to shoot it like a football match, just go down. So Kotcheff went down onto the studio floor to work out with the actors how they were going to cover Gareth Evans' absence, kind of a reported speech, oh, so-and-so told me, whatever. And so Kotcheff went down to the studio floor, and Lambert took control of directing from the gallery, because obviously she was the PA. So in a live television drama, much like the PA does now in any live kind of TV entertainment show, what have you, they will call the shots, and so they're all across what's going on. And they know what cuts are coming up, what angles and so forth. So I think that's maybe one of the reasons why Lambert got so frustrated that they wouldn't give her a chance as director, because when she proved that she could do it, she'd taken over the gallery part of directing when Underground, but when this had happened. So I think that's one of the reasons why she ended up going to New York, because she couldn't couldn't get that promotion. But yes, there's been one of the, I think the only known death, certainly in the UK, during a live television drama, and so Newman, Kotcheff, and Lambert had all had to deal with it. It's a shame, actually. In Kotcheff's book, I don't know if you've read it, he barely talks about Lambert. The only mention he gives to Lambert in his book, really, is he talks about how a friend of his wanted to get a divorce, and you know how in those days you kind of needed to have grounds for a divorce.
Yes.
So Lambert was roped into helping his friend get a divorce by being found, quote unquote, in bed with this friend of his, in a hotel, so that the solicitors or the lawyers or whatever could get the evidence that this man had been, quote unquote, unfaithful. So the only mention she gets in his book is of being in this kind of being a stooge in this kind of setup to help his friend get a divorce, which I thought was a bit shame. I was a bit disappointed. He is quoted. Richard Marson, who did the biography of Verity Lambert, did talk to Kotcheff about their relationship, and he's quoted in Richard's book, which is also available from 10 Acre Films.
That's
and
right.
Very highly recommended. And one of the interesting things actually I found about that was that Kotcheff talks about how Lambert's parents were actually quite disapproving of their relationship because they were Jewish, and they wanted her to be in a relationship with someone who was Jewish. They didn't like the idea of her being in a relationship with someone who wasn't part of their faith, part of their community. So they strongly disapproved of the relationship, which Kotcheff, I think, found quite obviously frustrating. I don't know if that's why they ended up breaking up. I don't know. We don't have that kind of detail about their relationship, but yeah. So it's I think that he's described, I think, in Richard's book as being, kind of the great love of her life, certainly at that stage. But I think the relationship ended up being sort of comparatively brief.
Switching gears momentarily, turning the focus back to you, what was the genesis of this book? How did Pull to Open come to be?
Well, I had written another book a couple of years ago, came out a couple of years ago, called The Long Game. And that was all about how Doctor Who came to be recommissioned in 2003. And I'd been very pleased with that. It had gone down very well with a lot of people who read it. It got some very nice reviews and it seemed to have been quite popular. So I was very pleased with how that had gone. And I didn't really have another idea for another Doctor Who, but I thought it would be a good idea to write another Doctor Who because from a kind of mercenary point of view. I've always wanted to be a writer. Ever since I was tiny, I've wanted to be a writer. I've really wanted to be a novelist. Sadly, I'm not very good at writing fiction, so I haven't managed to do that. But I can write non-fiction. I've known that for a while. I've had articles and bits and pieces published here and there, so I knew that I'm not the greatest writer in the world, but I knew I could put words together in a kind of professional fashion. So I knew that if I wrote another Doctor Who non-fiction book, it would have a chance of getting published because this one had gone very well. But I didn't really know what that would be. I remember I did an interview for a guy called AJ Black, who has a website where he talks about film and television, and he did a review of the book, a very kind interview me for his website. And in the last question on that interview about The Long Game, he said to me, is there another book? And I said, well, there might be at some point, but I can't really think of a good idea for one, so I don't know if there will be. And the more I thought about this, and I remember reading back that interview when he published it online, I remember thinking, it'd be a kind of shame to waste all the kind of goodwill I've got from The Long Game and not kind of take advantage of that and see if I could get something else. And I'd always thought that the story of the creation of Doctor Who had been very well told, and indeed it has been. What more could I add to it? But then I began to think about, well, there are a few different things. One of them is that no one had really done the creation, and that's the story. Usually when people tell the story of the creation, it's like I'm talking about the Bible, don't I? The story of the creation.
Right.
But usually it's at the start of something else. It's telling about Doctor Who in the 60s or about the Heartlear or something. But I thought, well, what if you just did the creation of Doctor Who and that was the book? The creation was the book rather than just the start of it. And another thing that was in my head was that I had researched a few years ago the life of Doctor Who's co-creator, Donald Wilson. And I'd written a piece for Doctor Who magazine, but when that eventually, for various reasons, when that eventually came out, it ended up being quite a lot shorter than I'd originally hoped it was going to be. So I'd had to cut a lot of stuff from it. So I had all this material about Donald Wilson. So I knew I could very easily write a chapter about Donald Wilson. But if there was a chapter about Donald Wilson, what's that a chapter of? And it just all coalesced in my mind. Obviously, I knew the 60th anniversary was coming up not very far away, and I knew that it was an era and a time and a part of the show's history and history generally that I was interested in. So it was something that I knew there was a lot of material about, but I also know it was something I would be find interesting to research, and all that came together. So eventually on the 16th of January 2022, I sat down and I wrote the words, "When did Doctor Who begin?" which are still the first words of chapter 1 of the book.
What was the biggest surprise for you? What was the biggest piece of conventional wisdom that turned out to be wrong, or the biggest myth about the creation of the show that turned out to be either untrue or actually surprisingly true? So, what was the biggest surprise you uncovered during the research process?
Well, I mean, a lot of the myths about it have been busted for years, haven't they? Things like, it was 10 minutes late because of the Kennedy assassination. It wasn't, or it was the first, non-news show the BBC had shown after Kennedy was shot, which also wasn't. Things like that. I mean, they've been sort of busted for years. People shouldn't get. I mean, it's not a book that's. You're not going to read it and think everything you thought you knew is wrong. But
Right.
but hopefully, what I've tried to do with the book, because one of the things that people really enjoyed about The Long Game, and what I'd really tried very hard to do with The Long Game, was to bring that kind of extra background and context to it, to kind of explain not just what happened, but why these things happened, and try and explain to people about what BBC television was like at the time, what the British television industry generally was like at the time, and who some of these people were, who are normally just names on a list, that kind of thing. I think one of the things that certainly did surprise me, which I really hadn't appreciated until I was working on this book, was how much work they did to the episodes after they were recorded. Because we think of Doctor Who at that time as being just a kind of full kind of live to tape show. They did it through in 25 minutes and that was it. And then they put it on television a few weeks later. But actually they weren't, it was being done in great long kind of as live rehearsed stretches. But there was more being done to it than we normally think. I mean, there's a memo from BBC Enterprises, the people who sold Doctor Who abroad, because what they'd wanted to do is to make their film recordings for selling abroad straight out of what was coming out of the studio on a Friday evening. So they were film recording the studio output because they wanted that, because they didn't want to have an intervening layer of tape. They didn't want the episodes to be edited on tape and then they made their film recordings. They felt that was an unacceptable step down in quality. So they wanted to make them straight from the studio output. But there's a memo that exists where in November 63, they've been doing this for the first few weeks. And then this memo says they're basically going to have to give up doing this because of a couple of reasons: too much discontinuous recording, i.e. recording bits out of order, and also too much post-dubbing work going on. So there was always an editing session. So they'd record on the Friday. I think most people, but quick pressy for anyone who doesn't know, Doctor Who episodes were done on one episode a week. The cast would rehearse like you'd rehearse a stage play through the week, Monday to Thursday. On the Friday, they would go into the studio and they would do what's called camera rehearsal on the sets. So they would work through the episode and then on the sets and with the camera moves and so forth in the studio. And then on the Friday evening, they would record the episode. And then on the Monday evening after, there would be an editing session. And it seems it wasn't just like a top and tail of the episode. They were doing dubbing and all kinds of things because this memo from Enterprises says there's too much post-dubbing going on after the Friday nights, so we're going to have to make our film recordings from the final videotape versions. And there's another memo as well from Mervyn Pinfield, the associate producer of Doctor Who at the time, to the directors, reminding them that they must always specify which portion of the tape the film recording for the recap for next week needs to come from, because it won't always be obvious in case of retakes or discontinuous recording. So even though, they weren't editing to anything like the degree we do now. It wasn't, or like you do with a film show, a single camera show. They was still mostly done in long as live stretches, but they were doing more to it afterwards, I think, than we commonly thought, perhaps. And that was something that really surprised me. So that's probably quite a dull answer, isn't it?
No, not at all. When I look at the structure of your book and the volume of the book, the size, I have sympathetic palpitations about what you must have gone through wrestling this book into shape. How long was the research process? How long was the writing process? How did you decide to structure the book into the chapters that it wound up in?
Well, the kind of glib answer is that the research was probably almost 30 years from the point when I was given Doctor Who the 60s for Christmas 1993 at the age of 9. It's like a lot of these things. A lot of this is kind of baked into us, isn't it? We absorb so much. Well, if you're someone who's interested in the kind of behind the scenes side of it, you can absorb a lot of that as a Doctor Who fan growing up from all kinds of different sources and things. So I've almost in some ways been researching it for much of my life, just because, and it's it was January 2022 when I decided to do it, and I had a kind of finished draft by the end of that year. And so it was, I guess it was kind of there were kind of bits and pieces of extra research and things that I did through this year before it's published. But they're all kinds of different bits and pieces. I'd been before, when I was researching Donald Wilson's life, to the BBC Written Archive Centre at Caversham to look through the Doctor Who files. But I did go again and look through the Doctor Who files and some other files as well about some of the people who were involved in the process, who hadn't been as well researched before. People like Rex Tucker and Donald Bull and some of these other people who are just kind of fleeting names that pass in and out of the story, but still have their parts to play. So it was some of that, some kind of direct research in the files. There was lots of one of the great things for researchers these days, of course, is that so many newspaper archives are available online. Obviously, usually some sort of subscription, but there's a couple of really great sites. There's one called the British Newspaper Archive, which is part of the British Library, I think, where you use a subscription site where you can look up all kinds of different newspapers. And there's one called newspapers.com, which has newspapers from all over the world. So they were both very, very useful. All kinds of books. And, obviously there's very few people still around that I could interview. I did interview Waris Hussein and Carol Ann Ford and Bernard Lodge, who obviously did the logo and sort of produced the titles. And I'd interviewed a few years ago for a radio feature Brian Hodgson, so I had that interview as well. And I just tried to get my hands on any and all interviews that I could with people who are involved to one degree or another. There's various interviews in the BBC has something called the BBC Oral History Project, where they do kind of in-depth interviews with people who've had prominent or long-serving roles in the BBC. Usually, I think there's a bit more flexibility with it these days. Usually, only to be sort of made publicly available after death. But there's a great collection of these that the University of Sussex has now put online, and so they're available. And so going through various DVD commentaries and old Doctor Who magazine interviews. I was really lucky that back in 2019, for their 40th anniversary, DWM published an index. So you can look up their interviews and features relatively easily these days. So scouring kind of all the interviews I could find. But you know what it's like, I'm sure, when it's a subject that you're really interested in. It doesn't feel like hard work doing the research. In fact, I can't remember who said this. I probably read this in an acknowledgement in someone else's book once. They said research is addictive. And there is that whole thing, isn't there, about how you can end up spending all your time doing the research and you could go on doing it forever. At some point, you have to just stop and sit down and write the book. So it was hard work to a degree, but because it's a subject I was so interested in, it was really enjoyable as well.
I can imagine. Oh no, I have to read DWM. Oh
Yeah,
no, I have to watch
exactly,
a DVD and listen to Verity Lambert.
Yeah.
No, I have to talk to Brian Hodgson. That's probably the fun kind of research.
It was good. It was really fun to do, and it was interesting as well that I also, because as I mentioned, one of the things I wanted to do was to try and give some extra background and context about the BBC at the time and British television at the time. I ended up watching all kinds of different TV series that I hadn't come to before, shows that I knew and had heard of, and knew were well-known shows from the 60s and things, but that I hadn't got to before. So that was good fun as well. And as I mentioned, because Flight into Danger plays such a part in this story, even though I didn't need to watch it for the book really, but I really wanted to. So I just sent a speculative email to the CBC archives saying, is it possible to buy a copy of this for research? And God bless the CBC, they said, yeah, they sold me a copy, which was, it cost a fair whack, I won't lie, but it was worth it. And it was, God bless those lovely, polite, charming Canadians.
And it must be great to see young James Doohan in a role that is not Scotty.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And the other fascinating thing about it as well is playing the pilot, talking him down, is someone who I understand was a kind of very, very familiar face on Canadian television for years and years, but who I only really knew from a famous science fiction serial over here called Quatermass in the Pit. Cess Linder, who he crops up in one of the early James Bond films as well, playing Bond's American friend Felix Leiter.
Yes.
Yeah, but he plays the pilot, talking James Doohan down in Flight into Danger.
It's funny because the cast of Airplane is stamped into my head. Robert Stack plays the role guiding Robert Hayes down. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, the Hall of Fame basketball player and author and political activist whose Substack I receive twice a week, plays the co-pilot in a very funny scene. And the little boy on board recognizes him as Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, the basketball player. And when you said every passenger on board had chicken or lamb, my head immediately answered with Leslie Nielsen in the movie. That's right. I had the lasagna.
Leslie Nielsen, of course, who actually was I think he was a few years difference, but he was a Canadian actor of a similar generation to James Doohan, and they actually knew each other. They were friends, and it's funny how Doohan had got his kind of big breakthrough role in Flight into Danger, and years later, Nielsen became internationally famous in Airplane.
Which gave him a 25-year after career playing these the straight men in comedy movies. I want to wrap this up with three more questions. Number one, you mentioned in this book several times my friend Graham Burke, who's actually going to be on the show very shortly after you. Graham had done the research behind Sidney Newman for the Head of Drama book, and you mentioned Graham a few times in the text itself. Did you get to speak with Graham during your research process?
Well, I corresponded with him during the research. I have spoken to him before. He very kindly interviewed me for his podcast about The Long Game when that came out. But I corresponded with him because I'd read in his book this, in the part of the Newman book that he wrote. He writes about this correspondence from 1971 because the first person ever to, from a historical standpoint, to try and go back and research how Doctor Who was created was, oddly enough, Malcolm Hulke, the Doctor Who writer. Because in 1971, he'd been commissioned, along with Terence Dicks, to write a book for Piccolo called The Making of Doctor Who. And Hulke seems to have taken this task very seriously, and he decided to try and get to the bottom of how Doctor Who was created. And he wrote to various of the people involved. And Graham, in his book, quotes some of the correspondence between Newman and Hulke and Hulke and Donald Wilson. And so I wrote to Graham and said, does this, you talk about this interview with Donald Wilson that the Malcolm Hulke did, does this still exist? And Graham, bless him, another lovely, polite, wonderful Canadian, sent me this correspondence he got from Newman's papers, because basically Donald Wilson, the co-creator of Doctor Who, only ever seems to have done one interview about Doctor Who. It's so frustrating. He did a really long oral history interview in 1991 that exists at the British Film Institute, which I listened to. And I think the interviewers in that didn't know that he had any link with Doctor Who, so they don't ask him about it. And he doesn't bring. I remember sitting in the BFI library in London years ago, listening to this, and getting towards the end and thinking, they're not going to ask him about Doctor Who. They're not going to ask him about Doctor Who. They don't. It's so frustrating. But so this interview that Donald Wilson did with Malcolm Hulke in 1971, it was a telephone interview. Malcolm Hulke tape recorded it, had a transcript of it typed up. The only bit that still exists are the copy of the 2 pages that Hulke sent to Newman, because basically what happened is Hulke wrote to Newman, and Newman wrote back to Hulke and said, yeah, it was all me. I created it. It was all me. I don't mind telling you it was all me. Hulke knew Newman because Hulke had written for Newman at ABC. He'd written some armchair theatre plays, and he'd written some science fiction serials for him, the Pathfinders in Space serials, which people see as a kind of proto-Doctor Who. So Newman and Hulke did know each other and had worked together. So Hulke wrote back to him and said, well, the thing is, Sidney, you've told me this, but I've spoken to Donald Wilson and he said this, and he sends Newman these 2 pages from this interview that he'd done with Donald. And they survived in Newman's papers. And years later, Graham Burke found them and quoted them in his book. And he very kindly sent the scans of them to me. And what Donald Wilson says is that basically he and Newman created it together. He and Newman sat down and sort of came up with the basic format together. I mean, Wilson says it was Newman's idea that it should be science fiction, and he came up with the idea of the time machine, bigger inside than out. But and it reads so casually on the page. It'd be fascinating to know how he said it, but it reads like a kind of casual remark. Wilson says, although the title, as I remember, I came up with. And so Hulke sends all this to Newman and says, well, the thing is, Donald said this. And we have this kind of view of Newman, don't we, that he was very kind of protective of his status as the creator of Doctor Who. We all know the stories about how in the 80s he wanted to sue the makers of the UK version of Trivial Pursuit because it said Terry Nation created Doctor Who, and how he tried to get his name added to the credits as creator. And so you'd expect when Hulke sent him these claims from Wilson, you'd expect him to kind of explode. But he writes back to Hulke and he says, oh yeah, no, I don't think there's any great contradiction in what Donald said to you. I think, yeah, he did have a very large part to do with it. Yeah, maybe he did come up with the title, which kind of surprised me given what we know about Newman's later kind of attitude. But he does say to Hulke at the end of this letter, he says, I can afford to be magnanimous about it because, as you know, Mac, there's no money involved. So certainly at that point, Newman was kind of accepting that Wilson was a kind of co-creator. And so that was really fascinating. I mean, there's real gold dust from Graham. I mean, I don't know why Graham isn't more kind of celebrated for having discovered this, but certainly he's very much admired by me for it.
And I don't want to spoil all the revelations and twists and turns in the book, but there's one point that fascinated me, and it's a question that I'd never thought to ask before. This is my second to last question. What show did Doctor Who replace on the schedule at the 5:15 Saturday tea time slot?
Oh, I'm trying to think now. What was the week before? That's a good. Oh, it was Deputy Dog, wasn't it? Yes. Sorry, I'd forgotten for a moment. I think because they've chopped and changed. One of the reasons that they wanted to do Doctor Who was because that slot had always been quite kind of changeable. For years before 1963, it had always been a kind of double billed children's slot. So it would typically be one American show, usually a Western, The Lone Ranger, The Range Rider, this kind of thing, Circus Boy, which was apparently a Western, and so you get one of those paired with, or sometimes an animation like Deputy Dog or Top Cat, or Boss Cat, as the BBC had to call it, because there was a brand of cat food in the UK called Top Cat, so they had to bill it as Boss Cat. So you'd get one of those, an American show, and it would be paired with a British show, sometimes a comedy, like Mr. Pastry or Just William, and sometimes a drama. There was several that they did about a pilot called Gary Halliday, but they were always they weren't like a long series. You'd get like one, and then a little while later you'd get another one. So I think one of the reasons that they wanted something more long running to fill that slot was because they didn't like the kind of chopping and changing that kind of happened there. And in the few weeks before Doctor Who was on, it was being filled. That slot was Deputy Dog was in that slot.
Deputy Dog was a product of Terrytoons, which was sort of the low-rent animation studio here in the States. They are best known for Mighty Mouse, which played a big part of my childhood.
Oh, yeah. Do, 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 do. Yeah.
But with many of those late 60s, early 70s cartoons still in reruns in the late 70s and early 80s, I spent a good share of my childhood watching Deputy Dog reruns and doing the Southern drawl, never imagining that when I became a Doctor Who fan, that Doctor Who's time slot was previously occupied by a comedy cartoon about a Southern dog police officer.
Yeah, I remember it still being on when I was a kid. I remember in the early 90s, it was still being shown by the BBC. They must have got it cheap, I think. But it's odd that because Doctor Who gets put back. I mean, the original, it gets put back through 1963. Originally, they wanted to start it in the summer. It became clear very early on that was ludicrously over-optimistic and it was never going to start in the summer. Eventually, they settled on November the 9th. Then there was a delay. The schedule got put back a week because some coverage of an athletics, a track and field event ran over. So the schedule got put back a week. I don't know why they couldn't just drop an episode of Deputy Dog and put it. See, I'm trying to do it with the accent, Deputy Dog, and put it. But I guess because they thought they bought and paid for these episodes, they kind of had to show all of them. So it got knocked back to the 16th, and then I don't know why. At some point in early September, I don't know what the delay was this time, but it then gets knocked back to the 23rd. So I don't know why that happened, but certainly one of the delays was because they had to put this sport in the schedule. So Deputy Dog got pushed on a week.
And this last question is not factual. This calls for a little bit of speculation.
Oh.
But I hope you'll indulge me. Doctor Who is the product of many people, whether in terms of the creative idea for the show, the title of the show, the notion of the police box, the cast of characters, the sound design, the costumes, the hairstyles, the design. I didn't realize that Peter Bachaki was a concentration camp survivor, but that's a whole other story. If any one of these people had not been assigned to Doctor Who, if you were not given a radical young director in his mid-20s or a radical young woman in her late 20s desperate to make a mark as producer and using this as a springboard to do incredible things over the next decades worth of her career, if someone who had been less passionate and less dedicated been put into one of the creative slots, is it possible that Doctor Who could have failed if these right people had not been put in charge?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, it's. I think I describe it in the introduction as being almost a kind of alchemy that all these people happen to be in the right places at the right time for this to happen. I mean, that's one of the nice things about writing this story. We live in the universe where it went right. That's one of the great things about writing a book like this, and it has that happy ending. You can leave the reader on a high at the end as they ride off into the sunset and into history. So that's one of the reasons it's a nice thing to write. But yeah, I think. The two people you absolutely need are Sidney Newman and Donald Wilson. Without them, you don't have a Doctor Who at all. It doesn't happen. If you have them, Doctor Who almost certainly happens. It may have only lasted 4 weeks or 13 weeks. It may have been a disaster. But with Newman and Wilson, Doctor Who definitely happens in some form, I think. But without anyone else, yeah, it's all up for grabs, What if Ridley Scott had been the man who designed the Daleks, as he was slated to be at one point? What if Don Taylor had said yes to producing Doctor Who and it had been a very kind of cerebral, very, very literary kind of show? What if any number of people had said yes or no to different things? So, I mean, there might be another universe where it was a slightly different cast of personnel and it went even better. We don't know that, but there's definitely many, 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 if you believe in the idea of parallel universes, the one number of parallel universes where the ingredients were all just right for it to succeed are probably vanishingly slim compared to the number of alternative universes where it never reached the screen or it was a disaster and it's not remembered now.
Well, we all owe everybody involved in the creative process, from Sidney Newman and Donald Wilson all the way down to Peter Bertracki and Ray Cusick and even Vidal Sassoon with the hairstyle.
Yes.
We owe all these people a debt of gratitude. Paul Hayes, I also owe you a debt of gratitude for being on my show and writing this book that I've enjoyed reading so much. Thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank you very, very much for having me, and apologies for the long, rambling nature of some of my answers.
No worries. It is all absolute gold. Thank you again.
No problem. Excellent. Thank you very much.
It was an unusual feeling getting to watch The Star Beast on the same day and at the exact same time as the UK release of the story. As I have probably mentioned before in passing in many interviews on this program, as well as on Trap One, living in the States, it was very difficult to get Doctor Who after its 2005 premiere. There was no American distribution deal until Sci-Fi Channel took on a heavily edited version of the program in 2006. BBC America did not offer same-day airings until several years later, and even then the airings were not simultaneous, and the episodes were sometimes edited. In the form of the Matt Smith stories, there was a bespoke introduction by Karen Gillan in character as Amy Pond, only for the benefit of United States audiences, and so on. With the new Disney distribution deal, The Star Beast and all future episodes under the deal will drop on Disney Plus, at least in the States, at the same time as they do in the UK. That means I was able to sit down and watch The Star Beast at about 1:30 this afternoon. No longer do I have to resort to other means to find my Doctor Who unedited. I find it difficult to properly review Doctor Who stories on the day of their airing. There are new series episodes of undeniable quality or enjoyment, like Blink or Mummy on the Orient Express, which I know are special the moment that I see them. Every episode of the new series, with very, very few exceptions, tends to feature rapid-fire, witty dialogue, and this is always energizing and enjoyable in the moment. However, sometimes you look back on a story, seeing it for a second or a third time, and you wonder what all the fuss was about on the initial airing. Not every Doctor Who story, by definition, is going to be a top 10. Many Doctor Who stories are run-of-the-mill, or, to use a baseball analytics expression, replacement level. Most Doctor Who episodes are better than almost any other TV show that I watch, so even a mediocre episode of Doctor Who can be quite enjoyable. I am not quite sure yet what to make of The Star Beast. I do not have the same emotional attachment to the original comic as do many other fans. I enjoyed the episode quite a bit. Many laugh-out-loud moments, gorgeous special effects, a dazzling new opening credits sequence, and a TARDIS interior that you would love to just run around the way that David Tennant did upon entering the new TARDIS console room for the very first time towards the end of the Star Beast. Whether or not all this makes for a great episode that I am going to want to watch again and again, and that holds up to more critical Doctor Who fan style scrutiny in the coming years, remains to be seen. There is something that I used to call on Rekart's Doctor Who the fallacy of the moment, the belief that any brand new Doctor Who story that you're watching for the first time is the greatest episode ever. You saw it on Rekart's Doctor Who when the new adventures were being released, say 1994, 1995, and every new book that came out automatically entered the RADW rankings at number 1. Those were the rankings maintained by Shannon Patrick Sullivan, now of the Brief History of Time Travel website. Shannon's a good friend. Naturally, a lot of those books regressed to the mean, to borrow another baseball analytics expression. Not every story is going to be number 1. While I am still basking in the afterglow of watching The Star Beast, I'm not yet ready to say that it's one of my top 60 episodes of all time. See last week's episode with Sean Lyon. But I did want to hear from a lot of people. So, coming up next, my sit down with Jan Fennick. And then, because Jim always gets the last word, Jim Sangster is going to give us a very brief review of the story with a revelation and a discovery that I found stunning. Certainly I did not think of it myself. Once again, my hat's off to Jim. And then after that, we'll come back and tease you for next week. All right, Jan, welcome back. The last time that I had you on was at L.I. Who over the summer as we were counting down our top 60 Doctor Who stories of all time. I'll ask you the very first question. Now that we have both seen The Star Beast on the day of its release, do you want to amend your top 60 to include Doctor Who's newest episode?
Right now, no. But I've only seen it once, and right now it would not be in my top 10 or top 20 or whatever. I liked it a lot, but it's still not quite, and of course I'm gesturing so nobody will see this, it's not quite there yet. I liked it. I thought it was really good. I didn't think it was one of the greatest things I've ever seen. This was not a heaven sent for me.
So let's backtrack. You, I believe, are the moderator of the spoilers section on Gallifrey Base?
Yeah, I'm administrator and moderator there. So I've known a little bit about things going on.
But I want to establish that you know more than you're saying, and some of your knowledge may have colored your view of this episode.
Yes.
What were your preconceptions coming in with the return of David Tennant and the return of Catherine Tate?
I would say that Tennant and Tate were probably my favorite of the David Tennant companionships, pairings. And I loved Wilf. I liked her mom, or loved to hate her mom. And I thought that was like the sharpest error for them. But for a 60th anniversary year, I didn't want to celebrate the 15th anniversary of 2008, which at least currently, I will be perfectly frank, I feel like we're still doing that.
How did the opening of the episode strike you? What was it like watching Doctor Who simulcast live without commercials for the first time, without waiting for a belated BBC America airing, without having to hunt through various, not necessarily legal means to find the episode?
It was absolutely, that was like the best thing about it. I mean, I loved no commercials. I love the fact that nothing was edited out, that there were no hitches, and that a simulcast meant simulcast. And that anybody who wanted to watch it at the same time for the first run, if they had the time, could sit down, no matter where they were in the world. If they didn't have BBC, as long as they subscribed to Disney Plus or had a friend who did and was at a watch party, could sit down and watch the show. And that to me was just like phenomenal.
What was it like seeing David Tennant and Catherine Tate again? How long did it take you to accept them in terms of the universe of this episode?
In my head, I think my brain is still sort of editing it to lost episode, even though it's not a lost episode. I'm still kind of not, and this is not a criticism, but there not being any real difference, except being maybe slightly being a little bit more emotional between the 10th Doctor and the 14th Doctor. It felt very, very old school, which is not a complaint in some ways. I mean, I joked with somebody else. I said it was very much comfort food television, because it felt like we were back to where it was, and except for the whole, Donna's brain exploding and it being 15 years later, it felt very much like it, good and bad, that we did not have any other TV show, in the interim. It was just those two.
I had only read The Star Beast once before. I had purchased the IDW trade paperback edition of Doctor Who Classics Volume 1. That contained the comics from the first 26 issues of Doctor Who Weekly, the last, I think, 8 of which are The Star Beast. I would have bought that when it came out 15 years ago at Forbidden Planet in Manhattan. What did you know about The Star Beast coming in, and what do you think of the production of the Star Beast half of the story?
I liked, I knew enough about the Meep, and that the fact that the Meep was going to be, come off being, cute and cuddly and all innocent, and then ha ha ha, turning into this evil mastermind by the end of it. And, the fact that it messes with the Doctor and 2 young children. And I guess people had figured out fairly early on what Rose Noble's role was going to be in this story, because, again, we sort of figured out about her because, not quite a spoiler, but Andy Pryor had put out casting calls looking for a young mixed race trans femme person who was, could play, either was 15 or 16 or could play, he was slightly older, that could play 15 or 16. And I believe the name of the character, without the show being mentioned, was Lily. People with better deductive reasoning than I sort of like went, wait a minute here. So yeah, they kind of figured out that this mixed race character, trans character, was probably Donna and Sean's child, that, Lily was probably just a cover for Rose, and so on and so forth. And then slightly thereafter, Yasmin Finney got announced as being cast in the role. And I was just reading Doctor Who magazine, because when she was cast on Doctor Who, she was filming the show Heartstopper, which is on Netflix, but she was not, it hadn't aired yet. But I think Andy Pryor or somebody else had seen, oh no, it was Euros Lyn who directed Heartstopper, and Euros Lyn, who was a Doctor Who director of much note during Russell's time, called and actually recommended Yasmin to be seen, because he had already, Euros Lyn had already worked with her on Heartstopper. And so that's how she kind of got the role, because she was slightly older. I think she was 18, but she was able to play 15, 16. So we figured that out. And then we saw her on set because they were shooting, all the outside night location shots. And so we figured out that she was going to be and I can't remember the name of the girl in the comic, but the fact that she was kind of going to be in that role, which she was.
RTD appears to be answering his critics head on in this episode, because the fact that Rose is a transgender character is integral to the plot. And then, of course, you also have the unit's scientific advisor in an armed wheelchair.
Yeah, well, I thought that, once we figured out who the character of Rose was, I thought it was really great. And the fact that, first of all, Yasmin Finney is an excellent actress. And I would highly recommend anybody to watch Heartstopper. So I like the fact that he was actually dealing with people who were stamping their feet and throwing tantrums, that the Chibnall era was so woke. And, once RTD came back in, it was going to be happy-go-lucky, toxic masculine Doctor Who again. And Ruth Madley had worked with Russell in the miniseries Years and Years. So I think that's great too, because it frustrates me that Doctor Who fans, or people who purport to be Doctor Who fans, cannot deal with people who are not like them, and don't think that people who have been marginalized, who have not had representation, or maybe they've just been in the background, don't deserve or don't need to be front and center of these shows. And I'm a cis white, woman, Jewish, but kind of passing, because I'm not particularly religious. So, I know what my privilege is, but I'm also, I want other people to be able to, be out there. And it's good for kids. It's good for kids to see people who are like them, especially in positive roles. And to be like, oh, hey, that, I can be like this person. I can be like that person. I can be the Doctor, and not just be feeling like they can sit on the side, or, they have to play, unit soldier number 43 because there's nobody else like them.
Apart from the returning continuity, a Doctor that we've seen before, and a companion we've seen before, and apart from the fact that it's based on a graphic novel that is nearly 45 years old, given that the episode had to use some of its real estate to address all this, what was your overall impression of the hour?
I thought it went very, very quickly. I was shocked that 57 minutes went by in a flash. And I think that Rachel Talalay is one of my favorite directors, and I think visually this, if you didn't know Meep was a puppet, you might think Meep was not a puppet. I mean, it was very realistic. The Meep was beautiful. The Worth Warriors were beautiful. I think that we didn't have to get a long dissertation on who UNIT was or what they do. That worked pretty well. I really like the dynamics of the family. I like the fact that, if you didn't know how horrible Sylvia Noble had been to her daughter in the old series, you didn't need to know that, because whereas Donna was, mama bear for her daughter Rose, especially with the transphobic kids and, a lot of the stuff that was being said and implied there, Sylvia became mama bear for Donna in her own way, because she did not want Donna to see the Doctor, and she did not want her mind to burn and to lose her daughter, which was a very big change to where she was at the end of Journey's End. And she obviously took the Doctor's message to heart about treating her daughter better. So that was actually really nice. And I like the fact that, Sean was, we saw Sean, we got to know him a little bit better, because we really only saw him at the end of time at the wedding. And he the fact that he loves his wife, he loves his daughter, that he's just like 100% behind them no matter what. And, and knowing what Donna went through with previous romances, especially from The Runaway Bride, the fact that she's got a man who's like 100%, devoted to her and will back her up no matter what, was just beautiful to see. I mean, I was really happy for her. And I did like the fact that, she won the jackpot and got 166 million pounds, and other than the house, gave it all away to charity, because even having forgotten the Doctor, she still had retained that portion of, the selflessness, which she had not had when we first met her. She was a very selfish character. So there were hints of stuff going on there and changes, which I think were nice.
In sum, would you say this met expectations, failed expectations, or surpassed expectations?
I'll say it surpassed expectations, because my threshold was pretty low. Like I said, I was very cynical about it. I did not know how to take it. I'm still a little cynical. I'm seeing a lot of stuff online which irks me personally, when it shouldn't. That, Doctor Who is finally back after 15 years. It's been stagnant since the end of time, and a lot of just like discrediting of that whole period. When my feeling is, you may not have liked it, but it existed, and I like the fact that the Doctor actually sat there and did a litany of, I was 10, and then I had a bow tie, and then I was a Scottish man, and then I was a woman, and now I'm back. So Russell is not forgetting that chain. Again, to me, comfort food, fun episode, but at least for now, not anything outside of the box. We'll see what the next two episodes have, because they seem to be more experimental and weirder and more stuff going on. This is an adaptation of an old comic. These, we're putting all the people back on the chessboard where they were 15 years ago. This is what you know and love. Here they are.
All right, Jen, thanks so much, and enjoy the next 2 weeks after this one.
I will definitely do that, and I'm sure we'll be talking, whether here or offline, about everything going on, because I got opinions.
Well, that was rather good, wasn't it? Doctor Who's most amazingly realised alien ever, the return of Dr. Donna, an incredible performance by David Tennant, especially the moment where he's eulogising about Wilf, unaware that when they say he's not with us anymore, they didn't mean he was dead. That was heartbreaking. And that new TARDIS, wow. No wonder the Doctor was running around it so excitedly. I think I would have leapt into the TV and joined him. And then there's some lovely teasers towards the next few episodes. Surely it's no coincidence that Rose is a toy maker. Wow. Absolutely amazing. I really enjoyed that. I hope you did too. Bye.
Thank you so much, Jim. Again, I definitely enjoyed The Star Beast, but then again, in the spring of 2009, I also very much enjoyed Planet of the Dead, which was the comedic special for the planned 2009 year of RTD specials, just as The Star Beast is the comedic one of the 3 planned David Tennant stories for the end of 2023. Planet of the Dead, very much fun to watch in the moment. Years later, in retrospect, not so much. Granted, there was a lot more emotionality and import in elements of The Star Beast than you would find anywhere in Planet of the Dead, which, by the way, also grossly underutilized the volcanic talents of Daniel Kaluuya. Of course, we were not aware of that in April 2009. But I do not mean to be a bigger buzzkill than Buzz Killington. Insert unlicensed Family Guy clip here. I really enjoyed watching Star Beast, and I hope that when I come back in 10 years and do my Doctor Who 70 for 70, the Star Beast is on it. But time will tell, dear listener. It always does. Next week on Doctor Who Literature, we're going to hear from Jim Sangster again. Jim and I are discussing what may very well be the story that turned us children of the 1980s into Jon Pertwee diehards. That is The Mind of Evil, one of the last Pertwee novelizations to come out in the summer of 1985. It is a book that Terrance Dicks throws his whole soul into. It is a delight to read, and of course I have to fall into the trap of writing an audio essay that merely does not quote every single sentence that Uncle Terrance writes. Jim is along for a very hard-hitting and in-depth interview about different aspects of The Mind of Evil and the enjoyment of it. We hope you'll join us next time on Doctor Who Literature. Thank you for joining me on another episode of the Doctor Who Literature Podcast. This podcast is produced by David Barsky, Jim Sangster, and yours truly. This week's episode was written and edited by me. Our logo was designed by Jim Sangster. Special thanks to my special guest, Paul Hayes of Pull to Open from 10 Acre Films. This podcast can be found on most of your podcast apps of choice. You can find all past episodes at podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/Doctor Who Lit. It really helps if you rate 5 stars and subscribe. You can find me on Blue Sky and Twitter at Mastodon at Doctor Who Novels, that's Dr. Who Novels, and on email at Doctor Who Literature, that's drwholiterature@gmail.com. Please drop me a line with your comments, questions, and suggestions. Thank you for listening, and whatever you do, keep turning the pages.
Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who Podcast Network.